So I'm Nathaniel Popper. I'm a reporter at the New York Times, and I actually know nothing about any of this. Before 4 days ago, I didn't know the difference between plant-based and cell-based meat. I don't know that I could still explain it, but just over preparing for this panel has just been a sort of fascinating introduction for me. And I hopefully, seeing this whole world through the lens of the religious certifying organizations, I think is a really sort of fascinating way to approach this idea of clean meat. And just thinking about this question of what is clean meat, that's I think what the religious certifying organizations have to think about. So hopefully you will agree. So I have with me here Gavriel Price of the Orthodox Union and Mohammed Chaudry of IFANCA. And I think probably the place to start for both of you is just to tell me, very briefly, sort of what your organization is and what role you normally play in certifying meat. Okay. Want to start, Mohammed?
Well, good evening. First, Bruce and the GFI team, wonderful job putting this conference together. We really appreciate it, and thank you for inviting me. Okay. I'm a food technologist, food scientist, food chemist in that order. My last degree is for PhD from University of Illinois. I, along with a few other people, founded the organization called Islamic Food and Nutrition Council of America, acronym IFANCA. Rhymes with Ivanka. We started as an organization to gather information from the industry and share it with our own consumers to make the selection of whatever products were available, what we can eat, what we couldn't eat. And back in 70s, we really couldn't eat anything. Everything has lard. And a few years later, we start the certification. Now we offer Halal certification to all the major corporations in the world, basically. And our operations are in more than 70 countries. And Halal is a very simple concept. We avoid pork. Anything from pigs is not accepted. Most other things are okay as long as they're clean. There are three different things we look at. The acceptability, that it's halal. Tayyib, that it's good for you. It's good for not only for Muslims, it's good for everybody. And third concept is it's good for the world. All the inhabitants of this world, including animals. So we try to decrease the carbon footprint, and one presentation a little bit earlier, I believe it was from Better Meat Company, saying they're trying to get 30% of plant protein into pork sausage. For us, it's a double or triple advantage. That much fewer pigs are raised, that much less lard is created, which goes into everything, including cosmetics, and that much less gelatin is created, which goes into all the pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals. So that's basically our plan.
I represent the Orthodox Union. I represent the Orthodox Union. Our offices are based in New York. We're a global certifying agency. On the retail level, you can recognize our symbol. There's a circle with a U in it. The iced tea that was being distributed today had that little OU. The Cliff Bars that were out there, the Oreos that were in the green room. Those are all. That's how you can sort of recognize our symbol. It's pretty ubiquitous. My own role within the OU is actually not in the meat industry. Hasn't been. Each company that's certified by the OU has a list of their ingredients which they're approved to use. But one other company we certify is actually Impossible foods. So the Impossible Foods, like any other OU company, has their sort of list of approved ingredients, which they have to apply for and then be approved by us in order for them to go ahead. So for example, in the Impossible Foods was its own project where we had to go through the various ingredients that they use. I'm in the department that makes those evaluations. And in that context, I was sort of asked to be involved with the clean meat project, I guess we'll call it, when a couple of folks from some clean meat companies were interested in the potential for certification. And we have different people with different specialties within the OU, but since I have this background and role in the ingredient side, and it does involve some amount of knowledge of the whole process, so that's why I got involved in the clean meat question certification.
Great. So, okay, so we're here talking and going to focus on clean meat, so not plant-based meat, but meat that sort of derives from animal cells in some form, which obviously is not terribly commercially available and viable yet, but this is sort of the future we're talking about. So when we're thinking about that kind of meat that's derived from animal cells, I guess what are, in both of your views, the sort of religious laws, the basic religious laws that sort of come into play when you're thinking about this? Before we can get into, what are the problems, but just to start with, what are the sort of relevant religious laws when it comes to thinking about sort of cell-based meat?
Cell culturing for us is a very complex issue. The basis where the cells are actually harvested is more important. First, anything derived from pigs is not accepted, but even from the animals which are good for halal, we respect the life of the animal, and we don't like the biopsy being done on the animal to extract the tissue. Secondly, from the slaughtered animal, you could take the cells, but it has to be halal slaughtered. Same thing has to be kosher slaughtered to make it kosher. But then there are certain parts of the animal which are not allowed, and the cells should not be harvested from those also. For example, fetus, blood, any of the discarded parts of the body which are not good for food product. The second part then is, what is the process of manufacturing? What other ingredients are being used? Not only media, every single ingredient which comes into the play is important for us. So we'll be looking for, other than the cell, everything else should really be plant-based.
Okay.
Yes, from our perspective, one of the central questions is, how do you identify clean meat in terms of its status as meat? And one of the reasons why this is, not the only reason, but one primary reason why this is important is we have a prohibition against mixing meat with milk. That's something we, a traditional Jewish home has a part of the kitchen which is meat and part of which is milk, and we don't want to mix the two. So as a result, it's obviously very pertinent to us to know what's the status of this. Is it called meat? Because then if the status is meat, one important implication of that is it can't be cooked with milk. You can't make a cheeseburger, for example, from that. So that's extraordinarily important for us in terms of how to identify this construct called clean meat or cultured meat, or however you want to characterize it. Obviously, another reason why it's relevant to understand what the identity is, because like Dr. Chaudry said, we have an analogous set of rules, which is there's certain types of animals which are considered potentially acceptable once it's been slaughtered properly, and there's animals which are not. One overlap is the pig, is pork. So to understand what the origin of the cultured meat is has relevance to that question as well. So how we sort of the legal, the identity of this meat is important, both in terms of the actual kosher status of the thing, and also its implications for the mixing of this with milk. So we have to really think deeply about, whether this clean meat reflects the origin from which it came.
One of the fascinating things that came up in conversation with both of you is sort of thinking through the animal cells that you start that cultured meat with. That feels like one of the most important things that you're going to have to determine is that original cell and where it came from. And I think, is it right that that it could be a potentially very different thing from religious law if those cells are taken from a living animal than if they're taken from an animal that has been slaughtered? Those cells would be viewed very differently if they were from a living animal versus, is that right?
Correct, yeah, they would be viewed differently. And in our faith, there is a huge difference of opinion throughout the world, because there are two controllers of the word halal. First one is all the governments, Indonesia, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and others, who import products for others. They call the shots. Their religious authority would determine whether a product is halal or not. And the second, the king of the acceptors is the consumer itself. If consumer rejects it, there's no way you could make it acceptable. How we can make it acceptable, we have to be convinced that it is clean, it is acceptable, and there is nothing hiding in it. I'll give you the example of example used earlier about synthetic rennet or GMO rennet. Everybody back in 90s were talking about no GMO, no GMO. OU and IFANCA certified that chymosin rennet, I believe it was 86. And how did we convince our own people that GMO rennet took on the porcine trypsin, which was very common in dairy industry at that time. Now more than 80%, the first rate of cheese manufacture is done with that chymosin, synthetic rennet.
And so on this question of sort of where the cells come from, what is the distinction between cells from a living animal and cells from an animal that's been slaughtered?
Okay, so first of all, can you hear me now? Okay, so I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Pardon me. First of all, let me just make the following kind of qualification, which is that I represent the OU, and as I said, we're a kind of umbrella organization. We're an independent organization, but we represent many different constituents. The sort of authorities that we've spoken to. The reason why I make this qualification is I'm not going to represent this as a universal position, and I think different authorities and very experienced and thoughtful people may have different perspectives on this. But the authorities that we've spoken to, for the most part, I would say is consensus is that we have a prohibition. Let me just say as introductions, you can't eat an animal which is alive. So in a sort of very dramatic way, you can't take a limb from an animal. It is still alive and totally prohibited. We would apply that idea to taking a cell from, taking a biopsy from an live animal. We wouldn't certify it, let's put it that way. We wouldn't certify that product as kosher. So if you took pork from a live pig, we certainly wouldn't do that, but let's say it's from a live cow, we would avoid certifying that the clean meat that would have resulted from that process. From what I've spoken to, the senior people would be most comfortable certifying something which was done in a conventional way, and taking from a properly slaughtered animal, taking up the cells from that animal, and then reconstructing the meat. Part of the intense discussions that have been going on, and I was privileged to speak to some folks here at this conference, is which parts of the animal are considered the animal. So one of the interesting questions I've spoken to a gentleman here was, if it comes from a feather, from a live animal, is that part of the duck or the chicken? So that's an ongoing question, and it's sort of, I don't want to claim that's resolved. It's not. But that's one of the ongoing kind of, I would call sort of exciting aspects of this whole project. It's certainly a challenge, we'll put it this way. It's trying to make a determination on technologies which are heretofore unprecedented.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I think it's fair to say with both of you that this technology is early enough that you haven't come to any hard and fast conclusions about this. I mean, where are we in the process, and how far along are you in your investigations of it?
We have our own ideas with discussion with different religious and scientific groups. But our position is unless a company makes an application and provides all the information to us, we would not make a decision. Otherwise, it's a hypothetical question, and sometimes those hypothetical answers are misused.
I just want to, it was wonderfully stated. I feel the same way. In other words, we've made discussions. I've had the opportunity to visit labs that do this, and until this is sort of gone to it's premature to consolidate opinions about this. The prudent thing, like Dr. Chaudry indicated, is to go learn about this, experience it, see it from the beginning of the process to the end before sort of representing, okay, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
That's the right way to do it.
Okay.
And especially given this circumstances where things are evolving, people are making choices. I think we saw from, people making choices from month to month about how things are moving along, what's the best strategy. So prudence is the way to go.
You both emphasized that in both religious faiths, there are many different organizations that are doing this work, and there are going to be differences of opinion as you move through this. I think I've heard this from one rabbi. I think it was, it sounds like a minority opinion at this point, that the idea that if you could have essentially pork that was generated from pig cells that could be generated in a way that the final product wasn't in essence meat, and thus would not be treif in the case, not be unkosher.
Right.
Is that a possibility here? I mean, for either of you, is there a world in which you could take cells from a pig that maybe weren't from? I mean, I guess how do we even think about that?
Please.
Go ahead.
No?
Yeah.
You want to flip a coin?
Yeah.
Who can eat pork first?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very remote possibility that would happen, because from a single cell, you could create a whole animal. So the single cell is representative of animal. That cell is animal. Okay? So you cannot call it vegetarian. The only extension in our faith is some people consider porcine gelatin to be okay. It becomes neutral because it goes through so much chemical change. But majority of the organizations and countries, including ours, we do not accept that.
Right. As I mentioned before, our proclivity is to look at whatever is being produced as reflecting the origin. So in the relatively conventional scenario that you just described, I mean, we would avoid it. We certainly wouldn't want to certify something like that.
Okay. I mean, is there a world, let's take pigs out of the equation, is there a world in which the thing that cultured meat is not considered meat? Is parve in the Jewish tradition? I don't know if there's a notion of not being meat in the Muslim tradition, but is that a possibility that you could have something that grows out of animal cells in some form that isn't meat?
Let me just, one of the kind of exciting, I think some people are sort of actively focused on isolating cells from an egg, a fertilized egg. And from that fertilized egg, one can potentially construct, let's say, a duck egg, duck fat, or duck, maybe duck meat, I don't know, but certainly duck fat. So again, just to familiarize the folks in the audience with some general constructs. As mentioned earlier, there's a prohibition of mixing meat with milk. There's the third category that Nathaniel mentioned, pareve, which means it's neutral. So eggs are neutral. They can be mixed with meat or milk, and they don't have a status of either. The Impossible Foods has that status. It just says, commercially it's represented as just an O with a U. No other kind of qualification on that. If the egg has that status. So if one were to construct duck fat from an egg, according to the principle that I have been claiming, which is that this is going to represent the origin from which it came, it's hard to construct an argument, even though it might look like duck fat, taste like duck fat, and it's very convincing that this is duck fat. It'd be hard to construct an argument to say that it's meat because its origin was pareve. So it's an interesting possibility, and how that evolves will be a very interesting thing to watch.
So at this point, I guess the way to put it is that is a possibility that there is something that grows out of this that is not meat, even if it started from, in some sense, cells related to animals.
Exactly. Now, one important point to make is that there's another set of rules that we traditionally make, which is that if something looks like meat and it is identical to meat, there may be some reasons why some rabbinic authorities may want to say it should be treated like meat because it allows itself for misinterpretation. So if these guys do a fantastic job of making quote unquote duck fat from an egg, and it's let's say practically speaking identical to the real thing, as I said, it may be a responsible position for somebody to say, don't mix this with milk because it leads to negative consequences, and so it should be treated as such. So that's a coherent position that someone might want to state at some point.
Okay.
Yeah, it may not be meat, but it still is animal. And how would vegetarian and vegans look at it? And I think you have to consider that. The second thing is, how is the legal system play into it, FDA, USDA, everybody else, okay? So there are a lot of unanswered questions. I think this is a very, very preliminary discussion as far as I'm concerned. I have not reached out to the others yet to consult it. This is the first time we put out one paragraph for the other to see that this is happening.
Okay. I see it's an interesting specific question for you, Mohammed, from the audience, this idea, can clean meat be halal but not tayyib? And what might that mean from a marketing perspective? Can you define again tayyib?
Halal is permissible, okay? And haram is not permissible. So in God's domain, when you do something halal, you get the blessings. When you do something haram, you get your negative points, okay? Tayyib is one step further. Tayyib literally means good for you, okay? Is it good for you? And there are so many different aspects come into play, including the safety of the product. Yes, it can be halal, may not be tayyib. Tayyib goes much deeper. Okay? Although we try to connect them together, that's how it's in the scripture. What you eat should be halal and good for you. The same sentence.
So to come back to that, could it be tayyib, could it be halal?
It could be halal and not tayyib, yes. Okay? And then again, you walking on the edge, and that would be considered questionable. And for all the questionable products, our guidelines are avoid them. Okay? So the consumer still may not accept it, even if somebody decides, yes, it's halal, but it's not tayyib.
Okay. In terms of the conversations you've had so far with companies about the actual process, which parts of the process are the most important for you to understand? I guess we've talked already about where you get the actual cells from, so maybe we've covered that, but beyond that, what are the most important parts of the process of this culture meat that you need to understand to figure out, how to deal with this from a religious perspective?
There are two other aspects other than the where the stem cells are harvested from. The first is all the other ingredients, culture media, and other ingredients, materials used to produce that. Okay, and the third aspect is really how something is constructed, how much intervention takes place, how much can be referred back to its natural and how much is not natural. And that's the intervention like Impossible Foods had done, creating heme from plant sources. Okay? And that by some people might be seen as unacceptable because God may not approve it. That intervention is too big an intervention. We had the same issue with the GMOs. I think we have overcome that. And if this issue is raised 10 years from now, we might overcome that. Right now, it would be an issue.
We have, besides the original isolation, kosher also needs to reflect the status of the equipment. So the equipment that's used has to be dedicated to the kosher process. That's an important question for the companies that are beginning this, because they need to make sure that whatever is potentially going to be kosher and certified, if that evolves, is dedicated to that process. So the equipment needs to be like that. There are mechanisms for kosherizing something, taking something which had not been kosher and making it kosher. So that's an important component. Any other ingredients, if flavors are going to be added at a certain point, those flavors need to be kosher certified. And I had mentioned earlier kind of the list of ingredients that a company uses that has to be approved. So those are the other issue that would need to be looked at very carefully is just the actual, how would a inspector or supervisor who's representing an agency actually track that this cell became this piece of meat? And any responsible, any reputable or responsible, sort of obvious point is whoever's working with this from the technical or scientific point of view is going to want to have obviously extremely good labeling, because they're not going to want to confuse what they took from which place. But that whole process of tracking that this came from here and this is being used in this flask and this is going into this bioreactor and nothing else, and if there's a composite of various cells, that whole process needs to be tracked and represented such that an outside person can easily say, yes, this is exactly the thing that we're going to ultimately certify. So that's just something which is a manageable issue, but it's something which is unusual in terms of the technical details that this could potentially present.
Mm-hmm. Putting aside the kind of technical questions we're asking here, I mean, how do you think about clean meat? I think that might be interesting for the audience to hear. I mean, is this, I don't know, does your sort of faith tradition give you any broader understanding of how to sort of locate and think about this? Or even personally, I mean, is this something you have eaten or would eat if it was certified? I mean, I'm assuming it's not certified, so you couldn't eat it yet. But I mean, how do you think about this whole thing that's going on, this whole movement?
Well, first of all, I would say it's a very personal question. That our community is not monolithic by any means. So there might be people who are just, wow, this is exciting for various reasons. It's exciting for environmental reasons. It's exciting for animal welfare reasons. It's certainly exciting. I think it's indisputable for economic reasons, because meat production under kosher law, you lose a lot of the meat for various reasons. So the potential that it has to potentially reduce the cost of kosher meat is significant. So that's in itself exciting. So, but I mentioned that there are definitely, I would almost say by definition, people in our community who are very traditional based. We serve chicken on the Sabbath. It's a very beautiful, it's a hallowed time. People are very traditional. We almost are in principle very traditional. So there's going to be people who are not particularly excited about the promise of clean meat. They might, if it tastes as good as anything else, and if it meets the right price, and it's considered to be meat like conventional meat is, so then people may be interested in trying it. That's one group, and as I said, it's not something that people are certainly eager to try, and that's just a fact, and they're very established people. And then, as I said, there's definitely going to be components of the Orthodox or the faith community that represents Judaism that's wow, this is fantastic, and let's go for it. So it's a spectrum.
Yeah.
We represent both Islamic religious aspect and the scientific aspect of it. And our work normally is acceptable to majority of the consumers, government who come in contact with those processes. Now there are percentage of Muslims who are the outliers, more on the progressive side. They definitely would try it, and that normally is not the client base we serve. Yes, there would be some who would try it, whether it's certified or not. But what both of our organization represent is that if an item is certified by us, the acceptability of that product would increase because of our credibility and standing.
Okay. And there's an interesting question from the audience here. I guess probably needs to be the last one, but does this in any sense force you to reevaluate religious laws in any sense? Does this sort of force you to go back to the religious laws and sort of rethink them in any sense, or are those the kind of fixed point from which you evaluate this?
There are several levels of religious laws. One, the basic, which come out of our holy book. Then there are extension of that. Then when the things change, there is a continuous discussion to accept that. Back in 50s, when television was invented, and people said this is haram, nobody should be watching it. Similarly, all the other issues, whenever there's something new comes in, people are against it. After a while, it becomes acceptable. So the laws are also continuously evolving as things change. Yeah. We did not fly in the airplanes 50 years ago. Now we do.
I mean, in our case, the rules are the rules. It takes a lot of someone who's experienced and knowledgeable needs to be able to use discretion and creativity and just sometimes a deeper understanding of things in order to know how to apply the rules properly. And I think this is definitely a case where that type of the requirement for an authority to be able to know how to apply the law properly is and some with some and creatively even is this is a very interesting example of that.
Yeah. Great. That's, I think, a good note to leave off on. Thank you all, and thank you, Mohammed and Gavriel.
Sure. Thank you.